Imagine for a moment a postman walking his route on your street. But it's not long before you notice that I am not your regular postman, delivering the mail you might normally expect. You see, I deliver stories, tales of the grim and mysterious in particular. Ghosts and shadows haunt these pages, some inspired by true stories, others entirely from my own mind. And if you decide you're brave enough to see what I've delivered today, well, I warned you.
Black Dogs, a short story by David Sauter. Just a few more on the crooked one. Rick's eyes drifted downward once again. This bar, this old, sticky bar. He was sick of it. Done. At that moment, he could feel that same hatred he felt night after night deep inside himself, bubbling back up like molten tar. And it felt just as black. Each night he felt it, though he still, after all that time, had no idea if it was a hatred for the bar or for himself. The crooked one. That stupid penny beneath the epoxy. Loads of pennies all lined up on the surface of the bar, each one drowned in the same 1.5 inches of clear epoxy. Somebody was trying to be creative, weren't they? Somebody thought they were making something pretty friggin' special. Just a sticky old bar. Rick lifted the back of his hand and felt the tack from the last guy's spilled beer. Or maybe it was some drunk broad's cocktail, as she shifted herself in the bar stool. Whoever it was must have just left before Rick walked in, because that particular stool was still a little warm. The sticky paw print from Rick's hand was right on top of that stupid penny. That stupid penny he saw every night. The one that didn't line up with the others. The epoxy must have shifted that row when it was poured on, because the crooked one sat with one side resting on top of the penny next to it, and each time Rick saw that coin, it bothered him. Of course, he sat behind it every time. It was never purposeful, it was just the way it always worked out for some reason. Sitting behind the crooked penny every time, wasn't that just the story of Rick's life? His eyes floated up from his sticky hand to the bartender working that night, first resting on her hindquarters for a moment longer than originally planned, then up to her graying brunette hair tied together in a messy bun. Rick never caught her name, although he had noticed that rear end quite a few times, and had imagined his hand reaching over that bar and groping it just as many times. His eyes suddenly retreated to the TV behind her when she spun toward him. "You want another one?" Rick once again looked down at the penny, the ring from his glass just kissing the edge of that upturned coin. The last bits of foam slid down the inside of the 16-ouncer, finally resting on the shallow amber puddle on the bottom. Just a few more on the crooked one. That's the tune Rick's mind always sang when asked that very question, no matter who was working the other side of that bar, although he never uttered it. He was sure it would get a laugh, or even just a smile from Barbie there on the other side of the bar, but Rick's patience with himself had been long gone for years. Effort was pointless in all of his endeavors. Time to crawl on by like the other lowly creatures of the dirt. Slugs and beetles, just as ugly, just as angry. Nah, whiskey. Do you need me to call you a ride? Brunette Barbie's eyebrow cocked upward. She was getting comfortable with him. Maybe too comfortable. Just like Annie had. "What are you, my mom?" Rick shot back, matching her eyebrow raise. Sorry," Barbie said. "Just thought you already had a couple whiskeys." Her voice steadily fell more quiet and unsure in response to Rick's bushy gray eyebrow, which still sat up like a dog pointing out a pheasant in the brush. Without another word, she turned to the back to pour another whiskey. She paid more attention than Rick liked to his drinking, just the same as Annie used to before he corrected her. It was a long time correcting, though, that's for dang sure. Years wasted with that woman. Still being wasted, in fact. He often felt like he was bleeding, just being bled dry by that harpy. He could have, and probably should have, tossed her out on her butt half a lifetime ago. Now they both had aged like cottage cheese into the people they were now, but he hated her just the same as he always had. The whiskey glass hit the sticky old bar with a thud as Barbie slapped it down, without even bothering to clear away the amber puddle holder. Right on top of the crooked one. He put an end to the first inch of the burning liquid right off the bat, and rested his eyes once more on Barbie as she turned to face the TV again. There was a time, long ago, when that old witch at home had a trunk like that. Rick supposed that was all he saw in her, at first, and that was enough. Their problem started as far back as he could recall, her calling him out for his drinking and his enjoyment of the female form. He tried to tell her, warn her, more like, of what she was getting into early on. He was a guy, after all. Some things were just part of nature, after all, and it was ridiculous that she should hold him accountable for what nature deemed appropriate. Rick thought about how things might be different now had old Annie just accepted what she should have accepted, and maybe been more forgiving and giving. Heck, maybe then he wouldn't have gone sniffing around for bar hens back in the day. Maybe he would have left that skimpy redhead alone and went home to get a little instead. But no. Old Annie decided cold turkey was the solution to their issues. So in the end, what happened was of her own making. After years of unaltered fate, repeating itself over and over till Annie was more of a husk than a whole ear of corn, any guilt of his had been long washed away, and so he took in every dirty detail of Miss Barbie's figure each time she turned toward the TV. He knew he was now too old to catch this bartender's eye, but there was always a possibility. "Rick the Dick!" The gravelly voice behind him was an all too familiar one, and without even turning around his face grew hot, not from anger, but from irritation. The same sort of heat that Annie usually drew from him with her prying questions and her incessant nags. "Bruce?" Rick gurgled the reply through the last half of the whiskey, quietly hoping it would numb the irritation away. "Oh, Ricky! Ricky Dicky Ding Dong!" Rick turned to meet Bruce's puffy, bloodshot eyes. He was just a little further down the road of intoxication than Rick was, only a little more vocal about it. He cocked his head to one side, to straighten Bruce out a little as an arm shot out to stable himself on Rick's shoulder. That last whiskey was finally kicking in. "Been here long?" Bruce gasped, spilling a few drops of Miller's Finest just a few pennies from the crooked one. Just a couple hours, I think." Bruce cackled. Some spittle flew and disappeared beyond Rick's view. "Escaping the old lady, eh?" "I don't need to escape. I do what I do, and that's how it goes." "What's your secret?" Bruce let out another extra moist cackle. "That's for me to know, and you to not to." Rick's voice was reaching now, reaching that place that voices only go due to a certain amount of alcohol in the bloodstream. "Hey!" Brunette Barbie turned. He met her eyes with a pause, then looked down at the empty glass he still clenched in those dry, wrinkled knuckles. "Another one." "You sure?" Her voice trailed off, perhaps suddenly remembering their last exchange. "Another," he mumbled in a voice so low only he could hear it. "How's that truck?" Bruce spat. You know, the old beater I pawned off on you? Runs like a dead horse. Bruce staggered a half step back. What did you expect for $600? Rick wanted to knock Bruce out for years, but he supposed he was the closest thing to a friend that he had. They could chat it up in the bar at least, talking sports or women. But tonight Rick wasn't in the mood. Too drunk maybe, although that hadn't been much of a problem in the past. There was just something in the air that night, something trying his patience, and although Annie was there, he had a strange urge to walk home at that moment. The glass was more full than normal as she laid it on the bar with a small splash. Perhaps she just didn't want to hear him ask for another again for the rest of the night. Perhaps her intent was to get him so plastered he would pass out before reaching the door on his way out. Either way, he found himself wishing suddenly that their roles were reversed. It would make his desires a little easier to accomplish, just like back in the good old days. I changed my mind. Give it to him, Rick said as he put his cash on the bar and motioned toward Bruce with an unstable hand. Well, I won't say no to that, Ricky Dicky. Bruce chuckled, and Rick sneered. Barbie took the cash back to the register. Rick grabbed his jacket off the sea of pennies and scurried to the door. It was difficult to keep his footing on a floor that kept shifting under his feet, but he was determined to leave before she could see that he was $1 short. Good Lord, it's like being at sea. He swung the door open and stumbled out into the cold country air. Was it December? January? Who even cared anymore? It was cold, and that just made the irritation burn even hotter. A thin layer of snow crunched under his footsteps. His heavy boots left a typical zigzagging pattern in the snow of a drunken man looking for his bed at home, and it was going to be a long pattern, as Rick lived on the outer edge of town, out among the rest of the snags, just where he belonged. It was where he grew up, and he supposed that some lucky day it would be where he'd die. With each gray hair that became a lighter shade of gray with each passing year, Rick figured he probably had less time ahead now than behind. He knew that's what Annie hoped anyway. The snow began falling a little heavier, and Rick supposed that if he wasn't so inebriated, he might have felt a chill on his tingling neck. He pulled the collar of his jacket up all the same. Annie used to holler and nag when he'd go out like this. Sometimes it seemed like she hated his drinking fits more than his tomcatting. All the late nights he'd stumbled through that door, the rows they would have. It was lucky they didn't have neighbors for a good distance, or he'd probably have to hear something from them too. The nagging was finally put to a slow death when he started cutting loose on her. Just a quick one to the face, or her forehead, where the hair was pulled tight from her scalp. One night he was feeling especially done with it, and he used that bun on the back of her head as a tether for swinging the rest of her into the dining room table. That was probably the last. Was it the last time? He was too drunk to think about it anymore, anyhow. He remembered the red creek that flowed from her left cheek that night, and that was that. Never another word about his going out and enjoying himself. Just an accepted, mutual hatred for each other. Blurry. That's what he was seeing next. Lord, how did he find himself lying in the snow? That brunette Barbie. That devil bartender gave him those last few drinks. Whore. Devil whore, making him pass out in the snow on a cold winter night. She used her feminine ways to coax him into ordering that last several rounds. Of course she did. That place is her bread and butter, and a bar is the perfect environment for a seductress of her type to use her ways to line her pockets with what little cash Rick might have had. They are all the same. The snow stung the palms of his hands, and the side of his face that had been making its home there was now numb. He couldn't have been there more than 10 minutes, but the air felt colder, like the extra freeze just before dawn. Apparently, a little nap was all he needed, as he felt a little less drunk and, therefore, a little more able to walk a quicker, straighter line to the house. The house. He didn't even realize how close he had passed out to the house. Turning back briefly, Rick saw the soft yellow glow of the lights from town about a mile back, over a snowy hillside. A chilly breeze forced him to turn back toward home, and the skeleton trees creaked ever so slightly in the wind, causing small clumps of gathered snow to shake loose and fall to the earth without so much as a thud. Rick might not have even noticed it, if not for the yellow-orange blanket that covered the landscape from the old streetlight above. Midnight. It had to be close to midnight. Maybe even pushing 1. Rick pulled the sleeve of his jacket up to reveal his watch, just as frozen as his toes in that moment, it seemed. It had stopped dead in its tracks at 10:30. Rick knew he hadn't changed the batteries in a while, and the stinking cold of the night must have finally finished it off. It's got to be midnight now, at least, Rick mumbled to himself in a tone just audible above the crunching of the snow under his feet, and he took comfort in that thought. Annie would be long in bed by now. He would shake the snow from his boots and sneak past her room. Would he make it to his, or would he drop anchor on the couch for the night? Either way was fine with him. It was time for shut-eye. He ambled up to the entrance of the gravel drive, hidden by a few scraggly trees. A stranger would have had a hard time picking it out if not for the crooked mailbox sticking out of the ground in front. Rick hadn't noticed until just now that the snow finally had stopped, and the moon began to peek out from the clouds, bathing the new snow in a pale blue. Crunch, crunch. The footsteps became slightly easier now that he was walking under the cover of the trees that hung over the driveway. The snow hadn't penetrated much, and Rick could almost feel the warmth of the wood burner in his living room as his desire to be inside out of the frigid air grew more intense. If not for his eyes darting up to see if the wood burner was indeed operating through his window as he drew near to his backyard, he might have missed it. But he didn't miss it. Even in the backdrop of the dark woods beyond the bean field, he saw the shadowy figure. If not for the moonlight, he surely would have missed it. Rick's dry, cracked knuckles stung his eyelids as he rubbed away any lingering, drunken blurs. The dog stood in the middle of the bean field, quietly watching Rick as he stood still in his backyard. Too big for a coyote, that was for sure, and its ears, although perked as if listening, hung down in a manner that reminded Rick of a Rottweiler or a Mastiff. "Where did you come from, Mutt?" Rick's voice trembled as if frightened, but it was more due to the cold, although he most definitely felt an uneasiness about having a staring contest with a dog that looked like it could make a good show of taking down a Clydesdale. Making out the color was difficult in the pale light that surrounded them both, but it seemed to be as black as the woods behind it, which for some reason made Rick more uneasy. There was something about only seeing the vague shape of the dog and not being able to make out its eyes at all that sent a chill down his neck, which was no longer tingling numb. Rick gave it a whistle, perhaps to gauge the dog's aggression, or maybe just to get it to move so he could at least know for sure that it was a normal dog. He didn't care which, really, but the dog gave no response. It only stared at Rick until finally Rick felt his uneasiness give way to more annoyance. "Better not be here in the morning," Rick grumbled, "or I'll deal with you and then let your owner deal with finding your body." He turned back towards his house and made the rest of his way to the front door. What a night. Rick's head throbbed as he struggled to find the tiny metal handle to a screen door. The screen door that still had a hole torn through the top half when he threw a ceramic bowl at his wife of 33 years. That was years ago, before the last time he corrected her. Finally, his cold, calloused fingers grasped the slippery little thing, and he flung the door open with such frustrated energy that it smacked against the side of the house. Annie would be awake from that. Her bedroom was on that wall toward the back part of the house. But Rick didn't give a flying crap. His head was beginning to ache, and he just wanted to find that couch that seemed to grow more elusive with each passing moment. Next, he spied the front door's brass knob, gleaming in the blue moonlight, and without a second more of hesitation, it was clasped in his hairy fist. You witch! The growl of words caused a thick cloud of steam to fog up his glasses, but he was too angry to wipe them off right away. How dare she? How dare she? Annie had locked the door on him once before. Once. Oh, he couldn't wait to get inside now. He didn't care if the screen door had or hadn't woken her. He would grab her by the skinny little arm of hers and show her the cost of locking a man out of his own house. He didn't pay the bills to have his wrinkled little shrew of a wife use it as her own personal fortress. This time, she was really going to get something special from him. Annie! His shout went unanswered, but the light in her bedroom turned on. He saw the yellow flash underneath the blinds on her window. I know you're awake, you miserable witch! You'd better unlock this door. Again, there was no answer. But he did spot a part in the blinds now. She was watching him from the window, watching him make a fool of himself on his own doorstep. She was enjoying it. The part in the blinds vanished as soon as it had appeared. Then the bedroom light turned off. Annie! Rick screamed the name so quickly and so full of rage that it came out more like an animal's screech than an English name. What was she trying to do? Teach him some kind of lesson again? He would teach her something tonight, even if he had to break a window to do it. You open this door right now, woman? I swear, I'm going to stick your head in the oven if you don't get your carcass out of bed this second. He beat on the door with both fists. The glass in the front window shook, and snow fell from the top of the doorframe. On a warm day, his hands would have been in pain. Today, though, he was too cold and too angry to feel it. On again came the bedroom light. He stopped pounding the heavy wooden door. His face was hot, and with each approaching footstep he imagined more and more how the moment the door opened his hands would wrap around her scrawny little neck and squeeze like a pair of channel locks. Yeah, that's how he'd do it. He would give her a good scare, the scare of a lifetime. That's what a stubborn shrew needs to learn the lesson. He would let her know how serious he was. He would bring her to the brink of death, and she would learn. Yeah, she would learn then. His face was hot. He licked his chapped lips. His frigid palms suddenly grew damp with anticipation. Come on, then, you bitch. The blinds to the window next to the door suddenly went up, although the kitchen light had never turned on. He stared at the blackness in the window. Annie, he growled again, although lower this time, focusing more on shaping the words with his mouth rather than pure volume. Open this door right now. Suddenly, brightness, and his eyes stung. She had turned the front porch light on. What was she doing? Trying to give him an aneurysm? He squinted and banged on the door again, this time with one fist. Annie, I swear if you don't let me in now, you're gonna get it worse than never before. Of course, he had already intended on giving it to her worse than before, worse than she had ever had. But he needed to make a few fake promises first. He specialized in those. The porch light remained on, but the blinds suddenly dropped closed. Now his face was so hot he could feel his eyes begin to water with pure fury. Would he actually kill her this time? Probably not, but he had a good mind to put her in the hospital. He lifted his cold fist to smack the door once more. "That's it, you... you heifer!" he coughed. "That's it. I'm coming in through the window. I'm coming in, and I'm gonna knock your freaking face off. I'm gonna cut you up, and I'm gonna feed you..." He said all this while turning to walk around the house toward the big window. The window that he would make his new front door thanks to that whore inside. But when he turned, he was only able to step once. His eyes caught it in the moonlight as he stood frozen in the bright orange light of his front porch. "You..." he whispered to himself as the dog stood in his driveway, staring at him just as still as it had been before. Rick had no more words to say this time. Before, it had felt like any dog, and he treated it as such. Now, though, there was something weird about it. Its appearance was normal, other than its large size, as it would have rivaled a Great Dane in stature. But there was just some kind of aura about it that Rick couldn't explain, and suddenly the man who often felt so big felt incredibly small. It was as if the dog was both there and yet not there. Again, Rick was unable to see its eyes in the blackness, although he couldn't tell if it was the blackness of the night that made it difficult to see the details, or the blackness of the dog itself. Easy there," Rick stammered through cold and unsure lips. Stay." The dog stood still as a statue until that last syllable left Rick's mouth. Then its great head suddenly lowered. Its ears laid back against its neck, tight, in a threatening manner. Then a low growl that seemed like it came from deep within the animal's chest. Rick had been growled at by dogs before, but this was different. He felt like a child again now. "Hey now, let's take it easy." Rick took back the step he had once taken and found himself back in front of his door. He dared not knock on it again for fear that the loud banging would trigger the dog into an attack. The dog took a confident step forward, then another. It sent the message successfully. It was not intimidated by this elderly, half-intoxicated man in front of it. "Annie," Rick slowly said, starting quietly and raising his voice at the end. "Annie, open the door. I promise I won't touch you." The dog kept moving slowly forward. Rick matched each of its steps with a new step backward. It went on like that until he found himself next to Annie's bedroom window. He reached out a shaky hand, never taking his eyes off the massive dog, and tapped on the glass with his knuckles. "Annie, open the back door, please." The last word sounded unnatural, but he hoped that it sent the desperate signal he was trying to get across. "Annie, there's a dog out here. Open the back door, and I promise, I swear I won't touch you. I just want to get inside out of the cold, okay? Just open the door. Annie, please open the door." After a few seconds, the bedroom light turned on, but now Rick found himself past the back side of the house, moving out into the backyard. This time he couldn't see the bedroom blinds go up, but it didn't matter. His attention was now on the imposing creature in front of him. Each step with the massive black dog was the same as its last. It did not increase or decrease its intense stalking, almost like it was waiting for something. But the low growl continued. "Easy, boy." Rick was all out of things to say, and he wished again and again that the back door of the house would open, and that Annie would be standing there ready to slam it shut and flip the deadbolt. Then he imagined going back out in the morning with a shotgun and looking for the beast. But the door never opened, and the morning never came. His thoughts of morning and safety were interrupted by what sounded like another growl, lower than the first. Hey. Rick didn't mean to say anything. The word just erupted from his lips as he turned to his left. It was the direction of the field that the first dog had come from. A second black dog was staring him down. Rick guessed it was about 50 feet away, but he could tell that it was bigger than the first dog, even from that distance. In fact, this dog looked to be about the size of a small bear or a big hog. Rick would have rubbed his eyes again to make sure he was seeing rightly, but he was understandably afraid to make sudden gestures. Easy. His words came out like more of a whimper, and he had never felt so helpless in all of his life. The second dog lunged for a moment with a snap, then kept on its usual slow-moving course. It was too late, though. The lunge had sent such a shock through Rick's system that he suddenly felt the warmth of urine on his inner thigh. Oh no, no, Rick stammered. Were those tears on his cheek? Is that what he was suddenly feeling? Was he that desperate? Or was it just his eyes reacting to the cold? Then the first dog did the same lunging motion, and Rick would have pissed again if not for the release he just had. The stalking then became somewhat quicker, and Rick realized that they seemed to be trying to box him in. He was backing up towards the old barn that he had converted into his tool shed, and once he was against that wall, he knew that there would be no escape. Again, the dog's paces quickened, and the lunges and snaps became more frequent, and as they drew closer, Rick still tried and failed to spot their eyes, but all was black. Easy. Rick turned his head subtly to see the barn behind him. It was still a good 30 feet back, but he thought that maybe, just maybe, if he gave it a good sprint and didn't trip on his own feet, he could make it to the side door. If he could make it there, and the dogs didn't go around front right away, he could slam the side door behind him and run to the big sliding door on the front and chain that shut. That is, if the door wasn't frozen in place. Oh Lord, it might be frozen in place. Again, the two beasts took steps towards their quarry, and Rick glanced again at the big shed in the darkness. The light snow crunched under his steps with each inch he retreated. His thoughts began to swirl around to take some sort of offense. Could he kick the dogs away when they attacked? Maybe if they had been smaller, but these were so huge. His legs wobbled, and he realized kicking would be pointless. He felt like he was made of jelly. The dogs snarled. Heavy globs of saliva fell from their jowls, which curled over thick, sharp molars. Crushing teeth. Rick could see them gleam in the moonlight. White, bone-crushing teeth. Then, as suddenly as the first dog had arrived, it happened. Rick almost ran before they even leapt forward. He had been anticipating it. As fast as they barked and lunged, he was already pushing off his heels, going for the shed. The distance to the big sliding door couldn't have been more than 20 or 30 feet, and must have only taken a couple seconds to cover, but in that moment, it felt like those seconds would never end. It was as though the dogs controlled time itself now. Rick's heart quickened to the most rapid beat it had been at in decades probably, and at his age that was nothing to mess with. He was careful as he ran, almost planning each step, and, amazingly, he never slid on the snow. The beating of his heart rang in his head, but his ears allowed one sound to pierce through the bass drum. It was the vivacious, hoarse snorting of the dogs as they pursued him. They were close. Yes, they were right behind him. He supposed that if the shed had laid a foot further, the bigger dog would have a hold of his boot heel, and that would have been the end of the chase. There would have been no escape from those crushing jaws that would have made a pit bull jealous. But soon Rick's hand grasped the cold metal handle of the sliding shed door, and he swung to the other side with all his weight hanging off that handle like his life depended on it. There was a good chance it did, after all. The door was about 1.5 feet open, and Rick's jacket scraped against the wood frame on the other side. In a quick answer to an even quicker prayer, it seemed, the jacket didn't snag on anything as he swung through. Before he could throw the door shut, however, one massive set of canine jaws, now coated in foam and saliva, burst through the gap. Without thinking or hesitating, Rick kicked the head against the doorframe and the dog jerked its head backward with a roar. In an instant, and with every ounce of his weight, Rick slammed the heavy door shut against the opposite wall. A shriek escaped his lips as he threw the lock pin through the eye bolt. He spun quickly and flipped the light switch to the old shop light that hung from the ceiling. Then he was on his back. Whether he was on his back from exhaustion or fear, he wasn't then sure, but he knew now that he could lay for a moment and catch his breath. The dogs threw themselves against the door. It shook hard against the frame, and the old metal creaked loudly, but the big lock pin was holding. Again, they threw their heavy, muscular bodies against the door, but again the lock proved true. Rick had never seen dogs behave like this. He had never even heard of such a thing. Something was seriously wrong with these two animals. Rabid sons of... I beat you, mother... I beat you... Rick gasped. He felt a rusty taste in the back of his throat. Then his head hit the cold dirt floor to his back. Then a howl came. Rick's flesh erupted in goosebumps, and his neck knew a chill like he had never felt before. One of the brutes howled into the night, and soon after, the second one joined in. It wasn't a normal howl, at least not to Rick's recollection. No, this one went on. It didn't end. The two dogs howled until it sounded more like a siren than a howl, and it seemed to grow louder as it echoed through the two-story shed. The sound surrounded Rick, and he clasped his ears with his frigid hands. The howling bounced off the walls and ceiling, and went on until Rick thought he was going to have a mental breakdown. "Stop it," he groaned, squeezing his eyes shut tight. "Stop it. Stop it. Stop it." Then, as if obeying his order, the sound ceased. Rick almost thought he had gone deaf. His hands slowly released the grasp he had on his bright red ears. He looked down. There was a gap at the bottom of the tall sliding door that probably spanned about 2 inches. The yellow glow of the shop light overpowered the pale moonlight from outside, so all Rick could see in that gap was the blackness of the night. He reached a shaky hand up to the switch, hesitated for only a moment, then flipped it down. His eyes adjusted to the sudden darkness, and the first thing he saw was the shadows of the powerful legs on the other side of the door. They stood still, almost lifeless, but there was no doubt that they were there. Rick flipped the light switch back on. A shiver ran through his body. The adrenaline was subsiding, and the cold was cutting through again with a vengeance. How? How could they just stand there? Where did these mutts come from, and how long were they going to just stand there? Rick couldn't help himself. He thrust his upper half toward the door and screamed in frustration. He heard no movement on the other side, but they remained in place, he was sure. "Get out of here!" he hollered into the empty air, a cloud of steam shooting from his mouth. Nothing. After a moment, Rick started looking around the old shed. He thought that maybe, just maybe, there was something he could find that would help him in some way, somehow. All he could find was some rusty old gardening tools. He grabbed an old hoe and thrust the sharp end against the door. He hollered again. Yeah, you hear that? That's what I'm gonna drive through your skull, you mangy monsters. Get! To Rick's surprise, he heard a quiet crunch several feet from the door, like that of a footstep in the snow. He fell silent, holding his breath, waiting for more to follow. After that, there was nothing more. He waited a little longer, but still nothing. Did they retreat back to the field? Were they circling the shed? He couldn't tell, but he did not want to face a freezing night cowering in the shed. If they had left, he had to be sure. Shivering, he turned the light out again, and again he waited for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. The faint blue light from the outside revealed what he had hoped to see. There were no shadows outside the door this time. Nothing at all. An owl let out a call in the distance, breaking the silence. He was unsure still, as he blindly felt for the light switch, eventually flooding the inside of the shed with the yellow glow of the shop light. He quietly placed the hoe on the dirt floor and knelt down on all fours to listen for footsteps. The small gap at the bottom of the door seemed to stare back at him ominously. But, regardless of what secrets the other side of the door held, he brought his head down close to listen. Again, he heard the owl call, echoing through the woods in the night. There was another sound, he thought, but was unsure. Was it the wind? It sounded like it at first, but there was a pattern to it. Or at least that's what it seemed like. The faintness of the sound at first made it barely distinguishable from the noises of the surrounding night. But the longer Rick's ear was turned to the ground, and the closer he drew to the bottom of the sliding door, the more pronounced the wheezing became. Breathing. Something was breathing out there. The roar of the hound as its slobbering muzzle burst through the gap of the door interrupted Rick's investigation, and Rick felt one of the beast's strong fangs scrape against the side of his head before he recoiled back. He stood up on shaky legs and watched in horror as two sets of mighty paws began to furiously dig at the dirt below the door. Their progress was already astounding as the earth eroded beneath the claws of the hounds, and with each inch they gained, Rick took another step back. His hands trembled at his side. Sweat began to exude from his frigid pores as he stared helplessly at the digging dogs. Then there was another sound, this one coming from the opposite side of the shed. Rick spun around to meet it, and in horror he watched as a third set of paws began furiously plundering the dirt underneath the shed wall. Yes, there was a third dog now. Rick did not know its size or look, but based on the first two, he did not have any intention of investigating. The empty tool shed began to echo with the infuriated sounds of barking and snarling, and the hounds dug, and a helpless Rick turned from one side of the shed to the other, each time being met with a bigger hole forming under the baseboards of the wall. One of the holes was now so large that one of the beasts was able to wedge its whole massive head underneath. Rick and the hound made eye contact for only a moment, and Rick couldn't help but notice a crimson-brown gleam in its eyes before the dog snapped and barked in his direction. Then its head disappeared only to be replaced by giant digging paws again. "Annie!" Rick's desperate screams were drowned out by the fury of the dogs, and he realized he had only one option now. Without a second's more hesitation, he threw himself at the side wall of the shed and grabbed at the wooden 2x4s that made up its frame. There was no insulation in the walls, so he was able to climb it without too much difficulty, pulling himself from one board to another. Rick remembered that the roof of the old shed was just a thin layer of rusty, corrugated metal, and with a certain amount of exertion he might be able to push it off and be free from this entrapment. Suddenly, as Rick pulled himself onto the rafters, There was a cloud of dirt and dust as one of the mighty hounds burst through the hole like it was forcing itself through a birthing canal. It seemed to already know exactly what Rick was attempting as it leapt into the air in a second, astonishingly high, Rick thought, and it barely missed the rafter with its snapping jaws as small splinters of wood fell to the ground. Soon the second dog made its way through the hole, following the actions of the first by lunging into the air after Rick, who was still just out of reach. Rick threw his elbow against the old sheet of metal paneling that made up that section of the roof. His elbow stung instantly, but he felt that sheet give way just a bit. The studs the screws had been sunk into were now heavily water damaged, and they were only just hanging on. The barking and growling continued below, and Rick turned his attention downward just in time to see the third dog start to barely squeeze himself through their new doorway. This was the largest dog yet, though other than his great size, he resembled the other two exactly, and he left tufts of gnarly black hair behind as he scraped against the bottom of the sliding door to force his way inside. He jumped higher than the other two, grabbing the rafter with his massive canines and hanging for just a moment before falling to the ground, tearing chunks of wood down with him. Rick let out a raw yell as he beat the sheet of metal once more, this time with no care whatsoever for the comfort of his arm, and the sheet gave way with a mighty crackling sound. The dogs lunged into the air again, each time getting closer to Rick as he slipped out through the exit he had just made. He pulled himself the rest of the way out and then remembered the snow, but it was too late. His body slipped out from under him and he plummeted 10 or so feet to the cold earth below, hyperextending his left knee. Gah! Rick groaned in agony as he forced himself to stand up. Then he heard the dogs again. They were already trying to squeeze back through the hole they had created, and this time they would be much faster than before. Now, though, Rick knew what he must do. His shotgun, the one by the dresser. Yes, if he could just get inside, no matter what, and if he could reach that shotgun, he would be safe from the monster canines. This time he didn't care what he needed to do to his house. He didn't care about the damage. It was his life on the line after all. He would smash that front window and get inside. The dogs would hesitate to go through the window. Surely they would. They were still just animals after all. That leg, though, that blasted knee. It was slowing him down. The pain was almost too much as Rick squeezed out a tear. He couldn't run. He could only manage what could be described as a quick hobble. But the house was right there. It was so close. He didn't have the breath to yell out again for that ignorant wife of his. Not that it would matter. She was ignoring him on purpose tonight. He was sure of that. And she was going to pay for it as soon as this was over. He was going to make her sorry that she'd ever... The teeth of the dog sinking into the flesh on Rick's leg cut off his thoughts of retribution. He howled with pain into the cold, empty air as he was pulled to the ground. Rick turned quickly, his eyes bulging in terror. He kicked the dog directly on the forehead, loosening its grip for a moment. But before he could pull his leg away, the second hound was on him. Its fangs pierced the flesh on his lower leg, the same one bitten before. And before Rick could act, the hound ripped its great head away, peeling his calf muscle from the bone. Rick wailed like a newborn, and he felt warm drops of what must have been his own blood flaking across his cheek from the grisly wound. Then, through tear-filled eyes, Rick saw the third and biggest hound lunging at his torso. It grabbed the flesh on his back through his jacket, and, instead of ripping away like the other dog, it squeezed like a vice. Rick could hear one of his ribs cracking as the dog's grip tightened, and the breath was expelled from his lungs. "Annie!" He tried to call out, but his throat was filling with the taste of his own blood, and the word came out as a hoarse, gurgling gasp. "Annie!" The big dog began to drag Rick out to the field. Then the other two dogs joined in. each hound grabbing a different body part with the same crushing strength of the first. Rick clawed at the frozen earth with the only strength he had left, desperately groping at whatever he could. His fingernails filled with cold dirt, even his mouth, as it hung open, trying so hard to scream for help and for mercy from these beasts. But nothing was of any help. This once proud predator had now become pitiful prey. They would take him out to the field and devour him, he was sure. No, this couldn't be how it ended, could it? This wasn't how he was going to die, killed by random dogs on his own property. It couldn't be. As long as he still drew breath, he had a choice in the matter. He could still... He could... These thoughts brought no comfort to Rick as the grass of the yard against his bare stomach turned into old, harvest corn stalks, which pierced his skin like knife blades as the dogs pulled him voraciously over them. Over and over, Rick felt the agonizing sting of the corn stalks and the dogs' teeth as they adjusted their grip on his body to pull him even further into the field. Then all was still. Rick felt the ground stop moving beneath him, but the strong grip of the hounds remained. They had stopped pulling, and aside from their heavy snorting and breathing, they were motionless, almost as if they were waiting for something. Rick opened his blood-spattered eyes. He was in the most severe pain of his life, but he demanded to look into his attacker's eyes before they had their way with him. He used the last bit of energy he could muster to turn himself around at the waist. With an agonizing groan, he flipped himself over to see all three dogs now standing still, their mouths clinging to his legs and hips. Well, the dog stared into his eyes, that reddish glint still as piercing as ever in the night. What are you? What happened next would steal the very words away that Rick had formed in his mind, and its mystery would likely have answers to be found in his new consciousness. But for now, his terror and confusion would quicken his heart and make the man that had once derived so much pleasure from causing pain to others cry out not only for his wife Annie, but for his mother as well. Mama, is what he would scream, for this now was the most horrified any man could ever be in their lives, and few had earned such a sentence as old Ricky Dicky. The frost on the patch of cornstalks ahead began to simmer and melt, and the stalks themselves suddenly began to fold inward toward the ground as a huge hole opened up like a gaping mouth, ready to swallow everything in its path. There was a white-hot heat that flowed out of them all, and Rick felt as though the hairs on his arms had been seared away due to its intensity. A reddish-orange glow, similar to the glint in the eyes of the hounds, could be seen reflecting off the inner walls of the maw, and as the circumference of the hole reached its precipice, Rick could hear something new. The last sound Rick would hear as the hounds pulled his body into the maw, outside of his own horrified screams, was the sound of many voices crying out in agony, and the gnashing of many teeth, before the ground closed up again, leaving no trace of a burning maw behind. I know that you and Rick had some troubles, Anne, but I still think this is an odd decision, if you don't mind me speaking my mind. The teapot began to whistle as Annie, adorned in an old black dress, the only nice dress she owned, pulled the kettle off the stove and began to pour 2 cups. Father Michael continued, I thank you for allowing a funeral, and I understand that you are only allowing it in response to my pandering. But don't you believe your husband is due for something a little longer? Perhaps with guests outside of yourself? Annie put the cup of tea down in front of her mourning company. Then she sat down across from him at her kitchen breakfast bar. You're wrong, Father. I mean no disrespect by saying that, but I think it's high time I spoke my mind, after not, for so many years. Annie sipped her tea and winced. She looked at the priest. It's hot, she said with a smile. Okay, he replied, cupping his hands around the cup. What is on that mind of yours, then? You were wrong with what you said. What you just said about me and my husband having troubles. I mean, how so? We didn't have troubles. He had troubles. Rick was the most troubled man I've ever known, and I hated him. Yes, I'll even say it to a priest, as you can see, I hated that man more than anything. Anne? Do you know how they found him? Annie interrupted. Father Michael looked at her. There was no sorrow in her eyes. They were glazed over, but not with the tears of sadness. No, these were different. They found him out in the road, covered in snow. He had been stumbling home, drunk, as per usual. The police said that he must have passed out in the road when the Mack truck ran him down. The wheels smashed his torso into the blacktop like an overdone sweet potato. The priest looked down, forcing the image from his mind. Do you know what I did that night before I found out? What? The father said gruffly. I locked the door. I'd done that once before, and I paid for it. Rick beat me. I truly thought I was going to die that night, and you know what? I thought I was going to die the night that he died as well. I locked that door knowing what was going to happen when he came home. So I had that shotgun loaded and ready. I wasn't going to let him do it anymore. I couldn't let him do it. I lived my whole life waiting for justice to come, but it never did. So that day I made up my mind, and I didn't care if they locked me up for the rest of my days. I had already spent my life locked up, so what difference would it make? I was going to give that fool what he had coming to him. I was all done waiting on God. The priest sipped his tea. Well, what happened next, Father, what happened next scares me even now. And what was that? Annie paused. She sipped her tea as well. It didn't burn her anymore. There was a knock on the door. That wasn't the frightening part. I was expecting that. I was waiting, remember? Waiting with the gun. There was another knock, and my nerves were beyond stretched to the point of trembling, so I decided to engage with him. I was going to tell him exactly what I was going to do if he broke in, but when I went to the window, I saw... Father Michael waited, but Annie was silent. What did you see? Nothing. The priest sipped his tea again. I understand, Anne. I'm sure this is difficult for you to talk about. Just remember that I'm always available if you feel like finishing the story. No, Father, you don't understand. I saw nothing. What do you mean? Whoever was knocking at the door, when I went to check, there was no one there. Father Michael stared at her, his eyebrows inquisitive. I turned the light off. I supposed it was... Well, I didn't know what I supposed. The wind could have knocked the door like that. I then walked back to the bedroom. I thought that maybe if it had been Rick, he had knocked angrily on the door and run around back for some reason, although that's not normally how he was when he was drunk. She sipped her tea again. After a moment, the knocking on the front door began again. Only this time it was like a heavy pounding. It was exactly like Rick would have done in one of his moods. I actually walked out of the bedroom and saw the front door shaking with each knock myself. This time I didn't even bother turning the light on. I just went up to the blinds on the kitchen window and that one there by the front door and peeked outside. Then I turned the outside light on just to be sure of what I was seeing. Nothing again. Nothing! Annie exclaimed. Again, nothing! That was it, though. After that, nothing else happened. So, what do you want me to do, Anne? The priest said, a touch impatiently, unsure of this tale and the state of the woman telling it. Would you like me to bless the house or something? I don't know. Annie stood up to pour more tea. The father couldn't help but notice the slight tremble in her hand. I'm sorry, Annie, but I still don't see what any of this has to do with properly honoring your husband's life. I'm about to tell you. The tired-looking woman in the black dress sat back down at the breakfast bar with another cup of tea. Her eyes seemed to have more life in them nowadays from the last time Father Michael had seen her in church, and he had suspicions why. I wasn't much of a believer in ghosts or phantasms, she said. Not before the night Rick passed away, and I'm still not sure what I experienced that night. But after a lifetime of making my life a complete and utter hell, even after death, I think he came home just to give me one more night of fear. Even after death, and that, Father, is the reason I don't owe him one more thing. One more thing. Later on that night, as I sat in bed wondering what in the world was going on, I felt something. It was a sense of calm, I suppose. Whether it was God himself or something, I don't know. But it was as if something was telling me that everything was being answered for. That my old husband, Rick, was getting exactly what he had always deserved.